Isolation distance. How critical is this if you are set on preserving genetic integrity, either because you want to maintain a specific variety for yourself, or of course, if you want to sell it, you want to make sure you are selling what you say you're selling. So can you talk a little bit about what that distance looks like and why it's important to consider this? I'm sure, like everything when it comes to plants and seeds, it varies a lot amongst the different crops out there.
I will answer your question, but I'll push back a little bit.
Okay.
So I think if you're going to sell seed to a seed company on contract, you have to sell them seed that's isolated. Like that's important. Like they're going to sell to a client who's going to be disappointed if it's crossed up. So that's a specific situation. But I think that if you're growing seed for yourself, it's pretty exceptional, something that you want to really keep totally isolated. Like I'll give some answers, but I think when you're growing seed for yourself, you can be a little bit more loose than if you're growing seed on sale. And so I don't know if that's pushing back, but just I would make that
Yeah, no, I
distinction.
like it. I like it.
To another distinction is there are crops that are predominantly self-pollinating, which I'll call selfers, and there are crops that are predominantly cross-pollinating, and I'll call those crossers. So a self-pollinating crop means that the flower is like a hermaphrodite flower that produces pollen and receives pollen within the flower. And so the mother and the father are the same plant, the same flower. And so that's predominantly self-pollinating. And then a crosser would be a plant that, through different reasons, the pollen goes from one plant to another plant. And so they're going to have different parents, and they're going to there'll be more cross-pollination. And so there are about a dozen crops that are selfers. So stuff like tomatoes, lettuce, beans, and peas, those are fairly strong selfers. And if you grow them side by side, especially like lettuce, if you grow them side by side, you'll see less than 5% of crossing. So there will not be very much crossing. And 5% of crossing isn't that big a deal. And it'll probably be more like 1%. And so that means that, let's say you grow two tomatoes side by side and you harvest the seed from them separately, and you grow those rows out the next year, and you grow 100 tomato plants from each variety, you might only see a couple plants that have crossed up, which is not enough to compromise your production. And you can taste those fruit. If you like them, you can sell them. You can even keep the seed from them. If you don't like them, well, you can still sell them, but you don't keep the seed from it, you know? And so that's like a self-pollinating crop. And then most crops are cross-pollinating. And with a cross-pollinating crop, if you grow them side by side, you're going to have 50% easily of cross-pollination. And so the next year, it's going to be all messed up. And so if it's important for you to have those traits, you're going to have lost them. And you can't just easily select one or two fruit plants out. So for crossers, you need to keep them further apart. And in most areas, 1,200, 1,300 feet, about a quarter mile, is going to be enough to keep two crossers, like to almost see no cross-pollination, to have that less than like 5%, maybe 1% cross-pollination. And this is true in most areas, unless you're in an area where there's a lot of commercial seed production. Unless you're in an area there's a lot of commercial seed production. In that case, there could be a lot more pollen in the air, and just the sheer abundance means that your distances may have to be further apart. But for most people who are not, if you're not in a seed production area, 1,200 feet or even 1,000 feet, just to make a round number, will prevent most cross pollination. So those are the two extremes. There are some plants like peppers, they'll cross for a couple hundred feet. So if they're side by side, they'll be maybe like 5% crossing. If you really don't want to see that, you could go to 200 feet and you probably won't see much. But 5%, I don't think that's a problem, unless you have hot peppers and sweet peppers side by side. So those can cross together. So I always grow And I recommend that market growers who want to keep their seed keep their hot peppers, in one area, and 200 or 300 feet further afield, you have your sweet peppers. And then you can keep your sweet pepper seeds, and there's a bit of crossing. It's fine. You might have a new variety coming out of it, but it's still edible. And it's not just it's edible, it's still sweet. Whereas the hot peppers, if they cross up, then you have some new exciting things. And people always love new exciting hot peppers. And so you have a chance to find something, but there's not a chance that it's going to be sweet in that case. It'll still be hot. So really, the important distinction is to know the difference between selfers and crossers. And you should assume a crop is a crosser unless you know otherwise. And there's really, like as I was saying, about a dozen selfers. So just to go back on them, tomatoes, lettuce, beans, peas, also escarole, which is maybe not as common a crop. These are pretty strong selfers. Something like peppers, eggplants are more intermediate selfers. Something like okra is a little bit still on the selfer side, but a little bit in between the selfer, even more intermediate selfer than the others. And so that's something more that I put like 400 or 500 feet between varieties if you don't want to see any crossing. So those are the things to be aware of. And if you know if it's a selfer or a crosser, right away it gives you a good idea of what to expect the next generation. And I would say in almost all cases, I'm not worried about cross-pollination, assuming I'm not going to sell the seed and assuming it's not an heirloom variety that I've been given and I'm the only person maintaining it. Outside of those cases, I don't think you should be worried about cross-pollination because things are still edible and they can be exciting. But the exception is the squash family. So in the squash family, there are 4 species, 3 that are more commonly grown in most places. So the 3 species, there's the Cucurbita pepo, which is stuff like pie pumpkins, acorn squash, delicata squash, and most summer squash. These are all pepos. There's Cucurbita maxima, which is the largest, like the giant pumpkins, and then also like turban squash or curry, buttercups, but not butternuts. So those are all some of the maximas. And then the muscata, the Cucurbita muscata is the last group, which is mostly butternuts that people are growing. Now, you can grow one of each species side by side, and you probably won't see crossing. So if you grow a butternut, which is a muscata, beside a curry squash, which is a maxima, beside a green zucchini, which is a pepo, they won't cross because they're different species. And this really it confuses people, but they're different species, so they won't cross. However, if you grow a zucchini beside an acorn squash or a spaghetti squash or a delicata squash, they will cross because they're the same species. And so they will cross. And in most cases, it will be edible. They can also cross with ornamental gourds, which have some toxic genes. But if you bite into something and it makes you want to retch immediately, don't eat it. There's a sign. But I would say with the squash, if you're not comfortable knowing what the species are, I would put those aside as a first crop to keep seed from. And I'd be more worried about isolation distances in those cases. But once you figure out the species, it makes it a lot easier to know what to be worried about.
I love that. And for a guide on all of this, people can check out your book, The Seed Farmer, A Complete Guide to Growing, Using, and Selling Your Own Seed.
And I mentioned all the different species and what's in them in there. So you don't have to remember just from this podcast, but you can also listen to it and re-listen to it many times if you wish.
Yeah, please do. Please listen and listen and listen and re-listen and buy the book while you listen.
Fantastic.